Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call the second day of the Peer Review Congress to order. It's 8 o'clock, and we are all about timeliness and being prompt. I'm Mike Berkowitz. I'm the electronic editor at JAMA and the JAMA Network, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our speaker. But first, some housekeeping arrangements. Today's abstracts should be available right now on the Peer Review Congress website. Go to the home page and click the link that says Plenary Abstract Sessions, and that should open up a PDF version of the program book in print that you've all received, and that will give you an electronic version of the complete and edited abstracts for today's sessions. Lunch today, it's a little early to be thinking about that, is again in the room on the second floor where it was yesterday. Unlike yesterday, there will be a poster session in the St. Galen and Montreux rooms, which are also on the second floor. That will be from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. It's a chance to take a break, but it's also an opportunity to see some outstanding science from investigators around the world. And so I encourage you all to ask questions and engage with the presenters at their posters. This day is a little different. It's going to be longer. At 5 p.m., Steve Goodman will be speaking on behalf of the Metrics Group on statistical review in biomedical journals. Can we get smarter? Steve Goodman is one of the smartest people I know, and he always has interesting things to say, and in his stentorian voice, he could read the phone book and it would sound fantastic. So I encourage you all to stay till 5 p.m. if for no other reason than to get to 5:30 p.m. when Patrick Bressert will be giving the Equator Lecture on what a reporting guideline can do, 15 years of STARD. That's the Diagnostic Accuracy Reporting Guideline, and that's at 5:30 p.m. on behalf of the Equator Network Group. Today's sessions, as yesterday, are being live streamed on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It's all a little new for us. It seems to be working really well. If you are watching the live stream now, you can submit comments on Twitter by including our handle PeerRev Congress, on Facebook in the comments section, and on YouTube on the chat function that accompanies the live stream. The YouTube page is new to the Peer Review Congress. We've created it just for this meeting. The videos will be archived in all of those places as well, eventually by the end of the year, we presume, on the Peer Review Congress website. So visit early and visit often so you can revisit the presentations and bask in the glory of what happened here these 3 days. And if you're tweeting, which we encourage, please remember to use the hashtag PRC8, which allows us recognition and allows us who are following the accounts to retweet, and you get attention as a tweeter, and it all is a positive feedback loop that works well for all of us. It's my honor and privilege to be able to introduce Dr. David Moher. He is a clinical epidemiologist at the Clinical Epidemiology Program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, where he directs the Center for Journalology. I may be mistaken, but I think it's the first and only Center for Journalology formally established. He is also a metrics affiliate at Stanford University and a member of the Equator Network and the Reward Alliance. He spends his time trying to improve publication science. He seems like a mild-mannered academic, but he's a mild-mannered academic like Clark Kent is a news reporter. He's really a superhero underneath. He's been working like Alexander Hamilton nonstop, relentlessly to improve what we do as editors in scientific publication and to make us better at our jobs. So without further ado, I'll introduce David. Thank you. Please give him a round of applause.
Thank you for that introduction, Mike, and thank you to the organizers and Drummond for inviting me here. I actually should thank Drummond for 30 years of support and mentorship. I'm going to talk about are editors and peer reviewers good enough, and I will come back and answer that question later on. I thought I would just give some disclosures. I have received some funding from some of these folks, support from others, and I'm involved in various ways with other groups as well. So I just wanted to try to get all of them that I can remember at least out on that slide. I'm not going to talk about any sort of innovations in peer review. The tenant piece would be a good starting point for folks who are interested in that. I'm not going to talk about what peer review might look like downstream, but the spot-on report is a good starting point, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. What I am going to talk about is how good editors are, some work that we've been trying to do to get editors a little bit better, and is that a sort of a framework for thinking about what we might want to do for peer reviewers. I wanted to put up this nice quote from Drummond 31 years ago, and I think it's a really nice piece. And I've underlined the sort of the last piece there in terms of in print. So I think it's sort of important to remember in context that depending on who you read, there are between 1 and 3 million articles published annually, and scientific editors, particularly editors-in-chief, are sort of ultimately responsible for what goes out of their journal. And they need to do the best they can, and that's enshrined in such codes as the Declaration of Helsinki, COPE, and lots of other groups are really pushing editors to do the very best that they can do. So back to the question, are editors and peer reviewers good enough? And I think for me the answer is no and no. And it could be a sort of a nice transition for me to end and sort of take some questions. But what I will try to do is continue. And I will continue, as I said, trying to use data and evidence. So in 2014, The Lancet published the Waste and Research series of 7 articles. And the 7 articles covered the spectrum of research from are we asking the right questions, all the way down to what about the quality of reporting of what we publish. And they weren't limited to randomized trials. They were really limited across the spectrum and included animal studies. And Paul Glasio led us in this final paper, and I just will go through a couple of examples here, all the way from the abstract all the way down to the discussion and the data, that there are some very significant problems in the quality of reporting research. And that's sort of aggregate information, and if we really want to take it down to the... well, I'm not quite sure what happened there. I'm missing the slide. Great, thank you. So if you took that down to the individual case, why I brought this up is really... it's a randomized trial, and I'm not going to get into the issue of the particular intervention. I think what I really wanted to share with you is that on an individual basis, we did this randomized trial. We involved over 40 journals, and we asked the editorial office, and that editorial office might have been an editor-in-chief, it might have been an administrative assistant or an editorial assistant. We asked them to do something really quite simple. We asked them that when they received a manuscript of a randomized trial, we asked them to allocate that manuscript to one of 2 groups. And what was interesting is that we had to, in a sense, throw away about a third of the data, because the manuscripts that were randomized were not randomized trials. So the editorial office couldn't detect what a randomized trial was. So that's a problem. That's a problem perhaps for those, particularly for those cases where it may have been the editor-in-chief who was randomizing and unable to detect what a randomized trial manuscript looks like. So in total, I think that this is really quite a waste of money. And what we really need to think about is it an avoidable waste of money? And certainly Glasio and Chalmers and others have noted that perhaps this is avoidable waste to the tune of perhaps 85%. So my view is that we haven't really accomplished optimally what we should have, and I think we have sort of problems in terms of the confidence that we should have in the literature, whether we value that literature, and whether we can trust that literature. And I think those three things are hugely problematic. And it may have led the editors of The Lancet to really call out a number of stakeholder groups, including scientific publishers and their editors, that whether we could more forensically look at what we were doing and whether we, in a sense, were getting value for money. And so I think that applies to editors and to peer reviewers as well. And in trying to solve some of those problems, at least for editors, I and a group of people tried to develop some core competencies for scientific editors at medical journals. And I used an integrated knowledge translation approach. I approached a number of stakeholders at the very beginning of this process, and what I asked them to do is whether we could work collaboratively in trying to develop some core competencies. So we had a program that lasted about 2 years. We did an environmental scan, we did a needs assessment, we did a scoping review. We really wanted to find out sort of what's out there in the literature about core competencies in terms of how we could train editors, scientific editors. We used a Delphi approach, and then we held a face-to-face meeting. At the consensus meeting, there were 14 stakeholder groups. I would like to thank the European Association for Medical Editors, who facilitated this meeting, which coincided with their meeting in 2016 in Strasbourg. I will just tell you as an aside, the medical school in Strasbourg has a winery, and they have a wine store actually in the hospital. It's the first sort of wine store I've ever seen at an academic hospital, but it may facilitate people feeling better. So at the consensus meeting, there were 14 stakeholder groups. Of course, we had to take our selfie, and we sat for about a day and a half to try to sort out all of the information that we gathered from the Delphi process and all the other things that we had done to get us to this stage. We had a number of post-consensus meeting activities. We finalized the core competencies. We have now 14 core competencies that cover 3 major categories. I will just share with you a couple of examples. We sort of tried to drill down in terms of the editor qualities and skills, what we were looking for editors to know in these core competencies. And another example is sort of editorial principles and processes. What information, what knowledge do scientific editors need to know? Beyond the competencies, we also did some additional work, such as we surveyed one small journal and one medium journal. We surveyed the scientific editors who were not involved with any of this process and asked them, what do you think about these core competencies for your day-to-day work? And we got some feedback from them about that, and so that's sort of part of the process that we had in terms of developing these core competencies. And from these core competencies now, we will try to develop some training programs that can be tailored to meet the needs of editors. And we will obviously, we've looked at the literature to see what trainees might be out there already. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. So thus far, we sort of finished the exercise a couple of months ago, and we have a number of groups that either have already endorsed these core competencies or who are ready to use these in their own sort of training exercises. I wanted to share with you that this manuscript, we had organized to have it published last night, and I received an email on Friday that there was some sort of production problem. So It's not going to be, it wasn't published last night, so I'm hoping that it will be published in the next few days, and that I can share that with everybody, but it will be published in Biomed Central, BMC Medicine, I should say. So that I'm going to sort of stop there for a moment in terms of developing core competencies for scientific editors at medical journals, and now going to sort of switch my attention to peer review and peer reviewers, and sort of give a little shout out. First, this is a peer reviewer week, so there's lots of different activities going on, and I'm sure many people in this room are helping organize and participating in some of those. So in a sense, with peer reviews, do we get what we pay for? In the vast majority of cases, peer reviewers are not paid in a fiscal way for what they do, and in some regards, even if we set the fiscal issue aside, do they receive an appropriate reward at their academic institution? And I would argue that they receive neither money nor appropriate rewards at their academic institutions. And here's simply one example of an evaluation to see, does peer review work? And Tom Jefferson in the late 2000s produced a Cochrane review showing that there was really minimal effect of peer review. I wanted to talk for a moment about the Bruce review, because I think it's enlightening for a number of reasons. One is they updated the Jefferson review, but I think this paper for me is more important for two reasons. One is it really showed that there seems to be wide variability in the sorts of designs that we use to assess peer review. And ought we as a community come together to try to think about some optimal designs that we could do in terms of trying to evaluate the effects of peer review. And I think if we can see a lot of sort of clinical analogies that we use very sort of standard designs to evaluate a drug. The other interesting aspect of this paper is that there's tremendous variability in terms of what do we mean by assessing peer review. What is it that we're actually assessing and measuring? And the analogy in clinical medicine was, 20 or 30 years ago, we didn't have a core outcome set, and now we have the COMET initiative, where we have a core outcome set that is used across all trials in a particular domain. And above and beyond that, people can add outcomes that they want to look at. And for the peer review community, do we want to think about a core outcome set that we should use when evaluating the effects of peer review? So I think those two issues, the issue of we don't have a core outcome set and we don't have optimal designs, I think are important contributions of the Bruce paper. So at least I'm sort of projecting, so far as I know, in my academic institution, there is no formal training for peer reviewers. And anecdotally, I've sort of spoken to many people about, is there formal training for peer reviewers in their institution? And I think the answer overwhelmingly is no, there isn't. The pre-report survey from published earlier this year, indicates that most people do want training in peer review, and the spot-on report recommendations are also strong on wanting training, and Patel has noted the call for professionalism around peer review. I am aware that there are some resources available, some journals, fellowships. But first of all, that's a very small number, and second of all, we have no evidence that actually these programs are effective in terms of what they're set out to do. So the question that I would sort of pose to the audience today is the framework that we use to develop core competencies for scientific editors, is it a useful framework to think about developing core competencies for peer reviewers? And I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I think from my perspective it would be useful. What I do want to share with you is my view in terms of training editors and peer reviewers. I think they should be based on a set of core competencies that it could be supplemented by publishers and journals, but that if we had a core set of competencies, it would also be quite useful for meta-researchers to think about downstream. I think those core competencies need to be evidence-based whenever possible. They need to be geared towards adult learning. They need to be self-paced. And I believe editors and peer reviewers need to be examined and certified. And they need to have a continuing editor and peer reviewer education. And I think also, particularly peer reviewers need to be truly rewarded in terms of hiring, promotion, and tenure. And I think for peer reviewers that we need to integrate training formally into graduate studies. It amazes me that actually we haven't done that. We have all sorts of graduate programs and courses, and yet peer review, which is not inexpensive in terms of its time and its money, we seem to be very laissez-faire about that. Let me give you in context to sort of real life. I drove to the airport, and I actually have a driving license, so I'm sort of certified to get from A to B. I got on an airplane to fly here, and I know that the pilot is certified as well. And I know the pilots are required to have continuing education as well, and it's a model that many physicians in this room will be familiar with. It's a medical model. So I know that when I came to the hotel, the requirement was that those people need to have some sort of qualifications to be able to serve me. When I got into the elevator has to be certified. So there's lots of things in life that require a certain standard, and yet for editors and peer reviewers, we seem not to have those standards, and to me that's a problem. So I started early on in this talk noting Drummond's text from 31 years ago, and I'll come to a close end. 30 years later, he's still asking for us to be sort of scientific in terms of what we know about peer review, our understanding about peer review. And I mention that because an examination of these first several congresses here, that most of the research is descriptive, and I think that we need to ask ourselves, is that sufficient to answer some of the questions, at least that I'm posing here today? I would ask people also to think about other external forces at play that might force us into some sort of action. Are we at a tipping point, or is someone going to come here in 30 years' time and sort of pose the same question? I think one for me is that it's very wasteful what we are in at the moment, and I think we all probably feel that we want to reduce that waste as much as possible. And I think we need to do a whole lot better for readers and for patients. And whether illegitimate journals are really going to force us to figure out how to distinguish ourselves from them. And one of those ways would be to think about peer review, and there are lots of other ways to think about it, but they're external forces, and they may force us to think about should we act now. So of course one of the issues that depresses me and a number of other people is when we start talking about money. Well, that's going to cost something. How are we going to do that? And I think I wanted to use the human genome example of where they take simply 1% of that to look at a bunch of issues on the ethical, legal, and social implications. Should we ask, the analogy is, should we ask publishers and journals and funders, should we ask them to come together to help to fund this? And I think we should, and I think we should really sit down and talk about that and see how can we get some funding to move this whole process forward, because I think we don't want to come back here in essentially the same position as we are today. We need to do a whole lot better, in my view. I wanted to acknowledge all of the folks who were involved from the very beginning of developing the core competencies, and thank you for the time today.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes for questions. Anyone want to approach the microphone? There's somebody coming up here. Yes, please.
I just wanted to share, I'm Vivian Bachelet from Chile. I just wanted to share my experience in teaching fourth-year medical students on how to submit a manuscript and how to peer review. And it was a very easy experience. We set up an OJS, Open Journal System journal that's very cheap to do, and it was called the Medical Journal. So at the end of their evidence-based medicine course, they had to submit the final paper in groups as authors, and then the whole cohort was assigned to peer review the other, so to speak, manuscripts that had been submitted. So I think that was a very successful experience. It was our first, maybe others have done that, but I wanted to share that as a way of introducing younger people, the younger generations, to what we're doing.
Thank you. I think that's wonderful, and I want to remain positive, but I think I want to come back to the Schroeder's slide that I showed you. The question that we introduce programs is a great idea, but we need to know, are they effective? So any program that we introduce, I think the obligation for us is to build in an evaluation component. I think it's not good enough to introduce programs, that we need to know, are those programs effective or not? And if they're not effective, we shouldn't be doing them.
Denise Goodman from Chicago. That was a terrific presentation, but I'm curious about one thing. When it comes to peer reviewers, at least, they have multiple competing demands. So the issue isn't always the publisher or editor, it's their university jobs. And the fact that peer review is not often recognized as an activity that fosters promotion. So how do we work through that conundrum?
Right, so that's a good question, and I could take a long time to answer it, but I'm going to try to be short and sweet. In 2017, there is no single place we can go to look at an aggregated list of what universities use for promotion and tenure and hiring. So that to me is an absolute calamity. We should be able to do that. I think what we need to do is engage promotion and tenure committees and ask them whether they're using evidence in terms of how they're promoting and tenure people. We need to move away from the publish to perish and value things that are important, such as trial registration. Why don't we promote people who actually register their trials or register other studies? Why don't we promote people who are very actively involved in the peer review system? Why don't we promote professors who actually formally teach peer review in an academic setting? So we need to change the incentives and rewards that we have in academic institutions.
In the back, please.
Hello, I'm Holly Nardini from the Medical Library at Yale University. And I'm curious about the core competencies in particular. The slide went by quickly of the names involved, but I'm curious about expertise to judge searches, and in particular around systematic reviews where we know that the searches are not always up to snuff. Sure. And as librarians are more involved in searching and creating searching in advance of publication, that's really helpful, and there is literature showing that that improves the quality of the paper. Okay. But I'm not always sure about the reviewers or the editors on that.
Right. So I think you raise a really good point. So you're looking at a sort of a specialty area. I'm an editor of the journal called Systematic Review, so I understand where you're coming from. What I wanted to emphasize is that we try to develop core competencies. So these are competencies that we believe are across the board. Doesn't matter whether it's a cardiology journal, a systematic review journal, that once you went to a systematic review journal, you may want to add to those core competencies for the very issues you're talking about. But we need something that could be useful across the board. So that's why we just developed core competencies. We didn't spend any additional time thinking about specialty areas, so to speak.
And maybe specialty areas could help with that.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're trying to do core competencies, and we want to involve others to supplement that.
I think we have time for just one more question with regrets. up front here.
It's just a very quick comment. Elisa Deranieri from Nature Research. I just wanted to flag that as a publisher, we are obviously very sensitive about the need for training peer reviewers. And just today, we've launched a new course for peer reviewers, which is free for everyone to use, and it will be on the Nature Masterclasses online website. So we are fully aware, and thank you for raising this issue.
Thank you, and I think it's wonderful that you've launched a course. I hope that you've built into that an evaluation of whether the course is useful or not.
Thank you.